Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote, "Everything is hard before it is easy." From Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. A brief review of the last part, where we completed Chapter 5, Overprotection, Part 2 of the book Position Play, after discussing the topic how to get rid of weak pawns, with illustrations from Nimzovich. Later, we went through game number 39 of the illustrative game section of the book as recommended by Nimzovich at the end of the chapter. So now, moving further in the book, we begin the next chapter, Maneuvering Against Weaknesses, which is chapter 6 of the second part of the book, Position Play, and is also the last chapter of the book. Nimzovich describes the chapter as maneuvering against an enemy weakness, the combined attack on both wings. He begins the chapter with the topic number 1, the logical components which go to make up a maneuvering action against a weakness. Nimzovich writes, "As an introduction to the following analysis, I should like to try to present a scheme of the operation which is to be considered. I picture the course of a maneuvering action to myself somewhat as follows. An enemy weakness can be attacked in at least two ways. Each of these attempts at attack would be met by an adequate defense. In order that, in spite of this, we may in the end conquer the enemy weakness, we take the advantage of the greater freedom of movement which is ours due to certain conditions of the terrain, so as to attack it in turn by different ways, maneuvering action, and thus oblige the enemy pieces to take up uncomfortable positions for its defense, whence an obstruction to the defense or something of the kind will intervene, and the weakness will be proved untenable or indefensible. As we can see from this scheme, it would be quite a mistake to label this type of maneuvering as mere purposeless moving to and fro. On the contrary, every move has set before it a clearly prescribed end, has the conquest of a quite definite weakness in view. The ways which lead to this conquest are, it is true, of a complicated nature. That is why such maneuvering play requires foresight, tenacity, patience, elasticity of outlook. The modern master is noted above all for their virtuosity in maneuvering technique. Moving further, Nimzovich discusses the next topic, number 2, the terrain, the conception of the pivot around which the maneuvering turns. Nimzovich writes, "The terrain over which any maneuvering action takes place must, if our plan is to succeed, be strongly built up. A characteristic of such action is that the different troop movements always cross a quite definite square or line of demarcation. An example is seen in the position on board. Here it is the point d5 which the white pieces will wish to occupy, making it a base for further maneuvering. Accordingly, the point d5 might be described as a fortified post in the lines of communication, and it is therefore right and proper to regard it as the pivot around which the whole maneuvering action turns. It is by virtue of this fortified post d5 that the whole operation is accomplished. Every piece, even the rook at d1, strives to get there at some time or other. The law governing this maneuvering action moreover demands that d5 shall be occupied by different pieces in turn, for this will always create new threats and thus help to embarrass the enemy. The relationship between the white pieces and the pivot d5 exactly corresponds to the contact between overprotectors and a strategically important point, which was discussed in the previous chapter. That in this case the pieces strive to establish contact with d5 speaks plainly for the strength of that point. Notice too the device by which pieces exchange stations in, for example, the sequence of white moves knight e3, queen d5 and knight c4, an operation which may serve the purpose of the general plan of the maneuvering action right well. We will now give some examples, some typical examples of this type of maneuvering. A pawn weakness which is to be brought under bombardment from the 7th rank. Rubinstein versus Selesnyev, 1921, position on board. There occurred b6. d4 deserved the preference. For instance, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, bishop g5, knight e2 check and king f2. Else rook f7. So king f2, rook f8 check, rook f6, rook takes on f6 check, bishop takes on f6 and rook e6. But b6 was played by black in the game and play continued with bishop f2, rook f8, rook e1, rook f7, rook takes on e6, rook takes on f2, rook e8 check, king b7, rook takes on f8, rook takes on f8, rook e7. And now begins some magnificent maneuvering against black's pawn at h7. Rook h8, king f2, king c6, g4, king d6, rook f7, a5, g5, a4, h4, b5, king g3 and c5. Black now threatens to make a passed pawn for himself by b4. So Rubinstein attacks the weakness at h7 from the other side. Rook f6 check, king c7, rook h6, b4, c takes on b4, c takes on b4, a takes on b4, rook a8 and rook takes on h7 check. The weakness has fallen. King b6, rook f7, a3, rook f1, a2, rook a1, king b5, g6, king takes on b4 and h5, where black resigned the game. The pivot is here to be thought of as in the lines e7 to h7 and h6 to h8. The student should seek to determine why the change of front of the 14th move, rook f6 check here, could not take place earlier. The following case is much more complicated, for it requires maneuvering on a much wider scale. B. Two pawn weaknesses. See the position on board. Here white's pawns at c3 and h3. The pivotal point around which action against the pawn at h3 turns, f4, seems to be threatened. but is rescued, and actually by a timely attention paid to the weak pawn at c3 on the other side of the board. So that we see here the two separated theaters of war logically connected, the one with the other. The play follows. Klashenkov versus Nimzovich. Black played king e7. If white would only do nothing, black would get the advantage by a direct attack by king to f7 to g6 followed by f5. White would then have to defend with f3 and would thereby give his opponent the handle to clutch which he has long wanted, namely after, of course, moving the knight at f4 out of the way, the posting of bishop at g3, when the threat to the whole of white's line of defense could not be parried. But white did not sit still. Instead, he did his best to hinder his opponent in the execution of his plan and played knight g2. With this, he hopes to bring off a general exchange which would lead to a clear draw. Thus, bishop takes on f4, and if knight takes on f4, then knight takes on f4, bishop takes on f4, and there is nothing left. The pivotal point f4, thus threatened, could not now be held but for the maneuvering action on the other side of the board. So there followed rook a1 check, rook c1, rook a2, and knight e1. The relief expedition carried out by black with his 37th and 38th moves, rook a1 check, rook a2, has succeeded. For now, with the rook at a2, white's intended exchange would lead to his own disadvantage. For example, bishop takes on f4 instead of knight e1. Then bishop takes on f4, rook d1, bishop d2, knight e2, knight f4, and after the sequel, knight takes on f4, g takes on f4, king g2, and rook c2, black develops a remarkable appetite. So knight e1 and king f7. So black has gained a tempo, but now the same game starts anew. Rook c2, rook a3, knight g2, rook a1 check, rook c1, rook a2, knight e1, king g6, rook c2, rook a3, and f3. This weakening move could not have been permanently avoided, otherwise f5 would follow, and if g takes on f5, then king takes on f5 and g4, yielding a passed h-pawn. So f3 and f5, it is accomplished. The end was peaceful. King f2 and king f6 to make room for the nizzle. Bishop c1, rook a1, king e3, knight g6, knight d3, and bishop g3. Reference the note to black's 36th move, king e7 here. So bishop g3, knight e2, knight f4, knight g1, knight takes on d3, king takes on d3, bishop f4, knight e2, bishop takes on c1, knight takes on c1, knight f4 check, king e3, and knight takes on h3. After a heroic defense, the fortress pawn at h3 falls. There followed only knight e2, f4 check, and white resigned, since rook f1 wins another pawn. C. The king as a weakness. See the position on board. For the terrain, there function here two possibilities of a driving action. As pivot, we have a line of demarcation. Nimzovich versus Kalinski, 1914. In this very piquant or exciting position, there occurred first bishop b3. The reply to bishop c2, f2, rook d1 would be king e6, and white cannot win. So bishop d3, d4, bishop d5, and rook g4. Not at once f2 because of bishop takes on e4 and so on. So rook g4, rook h5, f2, and now white doubles his rooks in the f file with a gain of tempo. Rook f6 check, king e7, rook f5, rook g1 check, king a2, and d3. We shall use the position now reached as a touchstone of the correctness of our thesis. We explained in its place that a maneuvering action is only possible if certain conditions are fulfilled. These were A. The presence of a pivot, B. A diversity of threats which might be directed against the weakness. The test turns out in our favor. Although this time the weakness is an ideal one and no concrete pawn weakness, yet the circumstances favoring a maneuvering action are identical with those which we have laid down as typical. Here too the variety of threats leaves nothing to be desired, for white plans by their means not only to force the king to the edge of the board, but purposes also to arrange when opportunity serves a pretty hunt, which shall drive him in the middle of the board. Nor is the requisite pivot wanting or missing, for the f file equals to line of demarcation across which the king cannot pass serves this purpose. Thus visualized, the following movements back and forth will be intelligible. Indeed, will gain in animation and in color. The game proceeded. After d3, rook e6 check, king d7, rook f7 check, king d8, rook f6, and d2. The border position now reached cannot yet be taken advantage of, for rook h7 would fail against f8 queen, and rook h6 obviously won't do. So he maneuvers further. Rook f8 check, king e7, rook f7 check, king e6, bishop b3, and bishop b6 question mark. Perhaps a6, giving a loophole for the king to creep through, was preferable. So bishop b6 and rook f6 check, double exclamation mark. Now the king has to face the choice. Either he may return to the side of the board, where his position will now be untenable or indefensible, or he must go out into the open, where fate in another form will overtake him. There followed king e5. If king e7, then rook f7 check, king d8, rook h6 and wins. So king e5, rook e6 check, king d4, rook takes on f2, d1 queen, bishop takes on d1, rook takes on d1, rook e2, and white won the pawn and the game. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzovich's My System here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream and direct donations. Several new supporters: MoveEleven, andmagical, and Jonatan Fredholm. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.